Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Dark Side. We are your hosts, TCStorm and Tabitha Purple. We're delighted that you join us. Thank you for stopping over and coming to see us today. I'm just going to edit the privacy on the post online so that everyone can comment. As always, we love your interactions and comments, so please do feel free to put anything in the questions and we will be happy to talk with you. Exciting. So, Mr. Storm, how are you doing?
I'm great. I'm always great.
Well, we've had a bit of a break. We had our two-week break at this time of the year just to recalibrate a little bit and pause, because the dark side is the dark side and it requires us to replenish. But we're back for a very special edition today, because this is our 3-year anniversary, or it's my 3-year anniversary. You weren't with us in the first year of shows, but it is the 3-year anniversary of the dark side. And I know it says season 5, so some people may confuse that for years, but there were 2 seasons that were very short in the middle there, because the first 3 seasons we were finding our feet, finding our way, deciding that we did have seasons, and learning about the dark side. So let's give you a little introduction to why we're here and what we are doing and what our purpose is. So the dark side was born 3 years ago in the pandemic. It was the first wave of lockdowns we've been in for quite some time. It was Mother's Day was coming up, and some colleagues and I were deciding what we were going to do for the mothers as they celebrated their first lockdown. Their first lockdown Mother's Day. And so we came up with all these really creative ideas, and we had some stuff on the Friday, the Saturday, we had preaching appointments, we had all of this positive reinforcement. And then the thought came to us, what about all of those people who really normally would struggle with Mother's Day, but this year this is going to be even heavier for those women who can't have children, for those people who have lost their mother, for those people who wouldn't be able to be with their mum. There is a real dark side to Mother's Day. There can be a real dark side and dark feeling. And so we decided to put on this one-off event. I would go live on Instagram and I would just talk to people about the dark side of Mother's Day. That was it. And by popular demand, the dark side was born. After that, I was asked, well, what other topics are we going to cover? What we're going to do next? And through that first 6 months that we did season 1, the first 6 months, which we're now calling season 1 on Instagram, we had some real highs, some lows. It has brought me to absolute tears. I will confess there have been episodes that made me cry for a week due to personal issues. There have been really great episodes that have encouraged and enlightened me. We've had amazing guests on the show. And at a certain point through season 2 and 3, while we were still trying to figure out how the format was going to go, I realized that this was a little bit bigger and it would require a lot more work, and having a full-time job, a family, and all of the other commitments, it was really difficult to plow all my attention into this and make it the best show. So we decided that it needed a permanent guest host, a permanent co-host, in the form of a brilliant researcher and someone who was able to dedicate a little more time. His life has subsequently changed since those early days as well. So we decided to have TCStorm on full-time. And many of you have been so delighted with that choice, and I know it was by popular request and demand that we have him back again and again and again. So we were really happy with the format that we're doing now, and from time to time we still have our guests on, and we'd like to thank all of the many guests that we've had on in the past 3 years. You have made the show amazing, interesting, engaging, enlightening. We have discovered a lot. We've definitely developed some ideas, and we're still on our journey to growing and moving forward with that. So yes, what are my highlights? What are your highlights, Mr. Storm, from doing the dark side?
Yeah, tomorrow.
It's hilarious. So today we're having one of those days, obviously.
Listen, I can't even remember what I did yesterday, so ask me something else makes no sense.
I hear you. I do hear you. I do hear you. I was trying to find something and now I can't find it. But anyway, so today we are doing the dark side. We are going to be here just covering some of our favorite topics, some of the things that we always want to bring in and discuss, but we also want to have a conversation with you today. We want to talk about how y'all are doing, what's happening in your world. So what's our first story we're going to cover today? I'm going to cover a story that Mr. Storm brought to our attention earlier today, and one that I think I have a bugbear of. It's probably one that featured heavily in the first year with people such as Dr. Kay Trail coming in and other fantastic educationalists we've had on over the years, and covering some fantastic educational stories. And so today is no exception. The Netherlands is in the process of their final exams, and one of the things that happens during final exam times is apparently that they have a lot of complaints. And so this year, more than 50,000 complaints from Dutch secondary school students during their final exams. And basically, when the centralized exam, so here we have centralized exam, which many countries will identify with. They happen at exactly the same time across the land, which you all will know happens in many, many countries through different times. But this time, their complaints line received 50,624 complaints about the exams. Many of the students complaining that the texts were, in fact, impossible, that they had not been prepped well enough, that information was coming up on the exams that they had not seen before. And basically, one of the things that has been blamed is the shortfall in teaching staff here in the Netherlands, and the fact that students are just missing huge chunks of their education. This is the first time that the exams are back to full strength. The last few years through the pandemic, there was an acknowledgement that students were running at a deficit because they hadn't been in the classroom. There was an acknowledgement that things were more difficult because staff, of course, there's a deficit in staff, etc., etc., etc. And so therefore the exams were modified to those situations. But this year is the full return to pre-pandemic exams, and they received 50,000 complaints. I mean, that's no small number. And for those of you wondering, the Netherlands has a tiered system of education. And so you go into education at a tier that is suitable to your academic level. But they have had the most complaints from those within the highest academic levels all the way through. The majority of complaints within the top 2 tiers. It's quite something. It is quite interesting, particularly as an outsider, to actually look at what's happening within someone else's education system, particularly from an educational background. So, of course, you know, I'm a former teacher, a high school teacher particularly. So I taught 14 to 19-year-olds. So those exam years, that's what I taught. I literally taught for exams. And so interestingly enough, when we're looking at this particular subject, I have a lot of opinions. I do. Most of them are very unwelcome in the Netherlands. In the UK, we are fond of criticizing our educational system. The teachers have a lot to say, and we have a lot of opinions about our education system, which we voice. And at the moment, the UK is going through some really difficult times with the amount of strikes, of course, with teaching staff, head teachers, and so on, striking over pay and conditions, and, you know, the excessive of stress that's being put on the educational system there. And so I have a lot of opinions about that too. But this particular one caught me by surprise because we're in the process of battling with the high school education, the secondary education here in the Netherlands, and trying to understand it and process it as well. And, you know, every twist and turn, it seems that the response that we're being given is not to question the system, not to question what's being done. And as an outsider, I find that very difficult because if I don't understand it and I can't question it, then how am I supposed to understand it? Only in questioning and examining and pulling things apart can you really understand what it is. That's the basic tenet of learning. But apparently what I'm being faced with is slightly different. So last year what they're saying is the number of complaints had hit a high of 285,000 this year. We're already at 50,000, and we are nowhere near the end of exam period. There are many, many more exams to come. So it's looking like it's going to be a rough year for the Dutch educational system. I'm curious as to whether this will mean a systemic change for how they do things. The Dutch system has a heavy focus on testing, and so children are tested 3 times a year for their high school education in centralized exams. They also have in-between tests, and there is a real emphasis on academic achievement being linked to test progress. So some of you in countries where that has been downgraded or abolished altogether, thinking of some of our European counterparts, you would notice that that is really quite a heavy burden on testing. And so it's an interesting system. So I'm curious as to what the outcome of that will be. One of the things that never fails to surprise me in some ways, but disappoint me, is the fact that with all of the talk about the importance of education, actually education isn't really that important, because what we're talking about is regurgitation and ticking a box, as opposed to the development of thought, ideas, and actually educating yourself beyond different ways of thinking. So this is going to be interesting how the years to come go, particularly with teacher shortages as they are in the Netherlands, particularly with how those are hitting critical subjects like math, Dutch and English and science. Those are hitting really hard. And so I'm kind of curious as to what's going to happen. So that's really the first story. Mr. Storm, do you have anything you would like to add to that?
Two things. The first is that globally, what is purported to be systems of education is actually systems of indoctrination. If you were to have systems of education, then the global world order would be upset, because you'd have too many educated people. And by that I mean capitalism will be screwed. Because here's a basic tenet that gets pushed out. Supply and demand. Okay. Now, this should show where capitalism fails, and the whole current argument in support of capitalism and wages is a failure, and where the education system is failing because they're not actually educating people enough to ask the critical questions. If, let's take the Netherlands, since we're talking about the Netherlands, there's a teacher shortage. Why are teachers still striking for wage increases?
Well, there you go. Yep.
Because supply and demand would dictate that the teachers' wages should increase because of the lack of supply. But you know who I've never seen strike for wage increases? CEOs of companies.
No, never. Somehow they never managed to make it.
I've never seen MPs strike for wage increases.
Nope.
Right? And so this whole idea that capitalism works, supply and demand, et cetera, is a fallacy. And if you were to actually work on educating people, they will be able to think critically enough to recognize this point and say, wait there, you said my wages would increase if there wasn't enough demand, if there were gaps in the employment market. Well, we know there's gaps in the educational employment market, but wages aren't increasing. In fact, you're being told, sorry, we can't increase your wages. We expect you to do more work, but we cannot increase your wages. Whilst CEO fat cats are pulling in record bonuses. So, yeah, that's my thought on that.
Well, you know, education is a favorite subject here on the dark side, particularly because we believe in education, and that's what we're doing as we discuss and talk with you, but also because we see the flaws in the system, and we want people to do better. We want not only for our children but for other children to be able to really enjoy the freedom of education that education genuinely gives, and the access and ability to read and diversify thoughts and, you know, really push yourselves is such an important point. But where you're having these systems which are weighted within capitalist systems towards not actually educating people, you are really struggling, I think. And I think you raised some really important points there. So it's one of our favorite subjects to talk about here on the Dark Side. Another subject that we like to talk about is of course, I mean, like is a strong, it's probably not the right adjective. One that frequently comes up is the misogyny, sexism, gendered violence. And so, Mr. Storm, you have a story that you want to bring to the forefront, which is out of Chile, I believe.
Yeah, I think Chile, the Chileans could teach a lot of Western nations a few things in regards to gender-based violence.
Okay.
So they've recently passed a law to give children whose parents or whose mother was the victim of femicide support until they reach 18. And the reason they did this was because they looked at it and they said, well, domestic violence and gender-based violence is a systemic issue. And they looked at it and they said, well, what happens to the children when the partner or ex-partner kills their mother and then ends up in jail for a violent crime? The children then often suffer. So one of the things that they wanted to do was to start by financially taking steps to readdress the imbalance and disadvantage that these children would have. And I think when you hear the minister talk about it and the recognition that it is a systemic issue and it is a structural issue, it's a lot further ahead in the conversation than a lot of these so-called enlightened Western nations who would look down on those in the developing South. And I think for Chile, it's actually necessary. This has been a problem that has been going on for decades, just as it has been going on globally. But I say this due to personal experience of having been in the country and building shelters for victims of domestic abuse. So it's good to see that the government there is actually recognizing the issue and taking steps to address or to start to redress the issue. They still have a long way to go. There's still the tendency to believe a man's word in these cases, unfortunately. But from the sounds of it, things are changing. It might be slowly, but it's progress.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you hit on a point. I think, you know, let's not minimize what it is taken for a nation to deal with that. You know, it talks about the fact that the UN cites that there are 4,473 women who were victims of gender related killings in 2021 in the region, and 12 women are killed in gender related attacks in the region every day. That's what it amounts to. That is a lot of children, a lot of other impacted people who are holding that are holding this awful situation in their in their lives. I mean, it's just a huge problem. And to have a government actually think about the systemic impact that will have generationally is really powerful. I mean, in Western countries, it largely goes unseen, and we're still battling with police officers that don't take it seriously. And there's lots of, evidence that we still have to
These
deal with.
officers are the main perpetrators.
In some cases, some countries, that may well be true. We've looked at the UK over the last months, and that has been quite
statistically speaking, the perpetrators of domestic violence within policing forces is insane compared to the general population.
Compared to the general population, yeah, it's a nightmare, for sure. And I think that's something to be reckoned with, that good solutions can come from anywhere, and we have to constantly be educating ourselves and dealing with and processing these issues in order to be better. But there's an interesting question that's come in. Does traditional Bible interpretation contribute to femicide? Oh, Mr. Storm, any thoughts?
Does traditional... I will say this. Actually, I have a question to ask. What do you mean by traditional?
You see that one? I'm glad I wasn't the only one. I thought, let me not make an assumption. Let me ask first a question about what would be the definition of a traditional Bible interpretation. And then I would probably have a few problems to poke into that. I think if I answered the question like this, does a patriarchal reading of Bible lead to or contribute to femicide? I would say that a patriarchal reading of the Bible contributes to many gendered problems, and femicide is one of them. I don't think that's necessarily, I think if you look at how the patriarchy is supposed to be in its truest sense set up, it's supposed to be a protective force. So it should technically lead to a more protectionist view of women, but we know how these things easily corrupt. And so if you take a patriarchal, if you're by traditional Bible interpretation, what you mean is patriarchal interpretation of the Bible, which has come to be known as traditional, then I think in that way, you can say it contributes in as much as patriarchy generally outside of biblical norms contributes to these problems. Mr. Storm?
Well, let me just post this because Daniel's just clarified.
Yeah, he says he means the man is
the head of the house.
But I worded it far better. Thank you. You're welcome.
I will say this. I think the problem is, I think my issue is that he's restricted it to simply a biblical concept. And I think the problem is that when you extend this to any society, then you start to have problems. And I think the best way to illustrate this is actually to take it away from the idea of gender, and we'll place it in a political context to show you what I'm talking about.
Okay.
When you have competent people leading, everything gets screwed up, right? So you take a look at Britain. You have a totally incompetent government. I mean, they managed to crash the British economy within weeks. Okay, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng just overnight.
Overnight crashed the entire economy. You're still recovering like a year later from their blunders.
Now the problem wasn't that there was a woman in charge or there was a black chancellor. The problem was you had incompetent people in charge. So when we're talking about the man as the head of the household, I think the question we need to ask in every circumstance is, actually, do we have competent people leading? Right? So for me, the idea that a man should be a head of the household, if you're not a good leader, you shouldn't be leading anything. But there's this sense of entitlement. But there's a sense of entitlement that you see within British politics and within the Tory party, that they are entitled to lead. They are entitled to the decisions they make. They are entitled to the privileges that they have. And you see the knock on problems that that causes down the chain for everybody else in the country. The problem with this is that when you have men who are not equipped to lead, believing they are entitled to lead, it causes problems for everybody else within the family. But do I have a problem necessarily with male leadership? No, but then I don't have a problem with female leadership either. I think the most competent person should lead in whichever area that is. You know, I'm like, it's for me, it just makes common sense.
Yeah.
Right? I'm not going to play somebody who can't handle money in charge of family finances. Just not going to happen.
Don't do it.
But then I'm not necessarily going to place or request that an indecisive person is there making decisions every day for the family needs. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. I think that, as I said, for me, it is when we look at the idea of patriarchal societies, and I think it's interesting that you took it to politics, but I think what's interesting is a lot of people will say, well, then it's just religious societies, because if you look at patriarchal societies that are Christian based, or Christian communities, or you look at Muslim communities, or you look at this other community, see, it's their religion, not actually taken into account. It's the thing they have in common is actually patriarchy as opposed to religion. Because if we look at societies throughout Europe, where the tipping point has become that majority are now would consider themselves atheist or not believing, are those problems extinct? Do we no longer have patriarchal problems? Is there no longer the idea of patriarchy? I'm sorry, is there no longer gender-based violence? Is it suddenly that because... No, the thing that you have in common is actually the patriarchy and not your religion. And I think religion can be a vehicle for patriarchy if made that way. But that happens within society, full stop, period. And you see that across the board. And I think so that's, for me, the commonality is actually we need to undo patriarchy. And that it's not an exclusive problem of religious practice. And in fact, I think we would do ourselves some good as religious groups, of diverse religious groups, to actually identify the fact that patriarchy is not our problem in, how do you say, not endemic, it's not our problem specifically in that it's core to our religious practice. If we looked at patriarchy as a separate thing and then put our religious practices and said, okay, so what about our religious practices is helping this vehicle that we don't want any part of, then I think we would do somewhat better in dealing with that. Instead, many people who are in the extreme camp like to hold on to patriarchy as if it is religion. And I think that serves nobody and does anyone any good, least of all the women who are being violently attacked and killed within this particular context. But again, the solutions come from everywhere, right? And we should be able to take that education and learn from what they are doing.
Yeah. And Daniel's final comment here, that common sense is becoming extinct, goes right back to the previous topic, that we have indoctrination, not education. We don't teach critical.
There is that. Well, there is a topic that we are commonly speaking about here on the dark side, which is, of course, racism. And we have two stories linked to that today, which I think will cover two very diverse bases of the conversation that we talk about here, but in our daily lives and trying to help people along with, which is politics and racism, and nationhood and racism. And so firstly, I want to look at the fact that Suella Braverman, since you've mentioned party politics in the UK, is accused of breaching the barristers' code over racist language. Now, she is a lawyer. I didn't know that. She's a barrister. And she is subject to the Bar Standards Board, even though she hasn't been practicing since becoming an MP, because she keeps her membership and everything up. She is still subject to those things. And so lawyers and faith organizations surprise, surprise, have actually lodged complaints with the Bar Standards Association, claiming that the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, a qualified barrister, has breached the body's code of conduct with racist sentiments and discriminatory narratives. Although Braverman has not practiced, as I've said, since 2015, the rules still apply to her. And since they haven't been able to somehow magically apply them to her in Parliament, this is a different tactic that people are taking to actually deal with that. So 9 organizations have taken the opportunity to lodge their complaints, including the Society of Asian Lawyers, the Association of Muslim Lawyers, the Joint Council of the Welfare of Immigrants, have all written to the Bar Standards Board, urging them to investigate and take action against what they claim is a racist and inflammatory language used by the Home Secretary about British men of Pakistani heritage and asylum seekers. The letter cites Braverman's comments in April that grooming gang members were predominantly British Pakistani men and hold cultural values totally at odds with British values. And so the letter also raises Braverman's warning that 100 million asylum seekers would come to the UK were it not for her planned immigration crackdown, and that people crossing the channel have values at odds with the UK and heightened levels of criminality. She described the arrival of asylum seekers in the UK as an invasion, quote unquote. These comments are not only highly inaccurate and offensive, but they also perpetuate harmful stereotypes and contribute to a climate of hate and prejudice. So the letter goes on, but this is to say that finally, I guess somebody has decided to take action against a woman who has taken action against her own community in many ways. It's the climate, the language that comes out of British politics at the moment is horrific, as particularly around migration, immigration, asylum seekers, so on and so forth. And it is really disgusting and it's very harmful. And you see the outworking of that on communities every day. I am reminded that not so long ago, friends of mine from the Polish community were at the receiving end of the hatred, and you know, and so on and so forth. And so this has really led to a climate of hate, I think, and I don't think there's any other way of saying that when it comes to relations in the UK between different groups. It's really exacerbating and manipulating information. But anyway, Mr. Storm, I'm sure you can do a better job of bringing home this point, other than to say good.
Just Daniel says she sounds like she plagiarized Donald Trump.
No, it's worse. It's really worse.
In response to that, Daniel, the people that I know that know her personally and went to school with her would say she is too thick to plagiarize anything. So, unfortunately, this stupidity is all her own. Look, she needs to be disbarred, but she won't be. And the reality is, she has no intention of ever practicing as a barrister again. She'll probably make far more money on the speech circuit once the Tories get kicked out of power in the next general election.
Who's paying this woman to speak and say anything? I mean, it's just like nothing. Every time she gets up and makes a speech, everybody's on like edge because she's going to say racist, slanderous, homophobic. I mean, the comments are just endless that she makes. Well, just horror. Who's going to pay her for that?
You asked who's going to pay her. My initial response was to say Donald Trump, but by his track record, he'll promise to pay her and never pay her.
Well,
look, there's a lot of people out there that will pay. You know,
I can't even begin to. Do you know? I think, to Daniel's point about she sounds like a plagiarized Donald Trump, and why I say she's worse, I think it's worse because she's a brown woman, right? She's a woman from their own community who's literally not only just turned her back on her people, but has become vile. Not just, you know, I've gone over to the other side, but you have become a vile towards anybody that isn't opposite to you, because you're not who you're advocating for is not who you are. Just disgusting, really disgusting.
Oh. She is what she is. And that is, anyway.
Yes.
Before YouTube won't put this up, I best keep my mouth shut.
Well, I think a story not too dissimilar, but linked to this when we talk about racism, is actually one that's brewing at the moment. And it's about the film Cleopatra. And it's been going for some time. And I've been just, adjacently watching. It's not something that's really come onto my radar, to be honest with you. But I'm going to just take Daniel's comments, because this comment is going to play into the next story. So unfortunately, there are plenty of people to pay. And because she's brown, it makes them feel not racist. Absolutely. Because she's brown, it makes them feel not racist. And to that point, the film Cleopatra has been made and features a black queen, basically. It's the long and short of it. But there has been some pushback from some Egyptian archaeologists. Some support it, some don't. And there's kind of this 50-50 split, from what I can tell, of people supporting and not supporting the film's portrayal. Now, the problem that we see in this is the anti-Black sentiments that have been raging towards the rest of the continent from Egypt, from these Egyptians. And so Zaha Hawass, I hope I said your name correctly, was due to give a lecture in Los Angeles, and he was protested by people because he objects to Cleopatra being portrayed as Black, and has gone on quite the forthright bender about it. And because he's an archaeologist, of course, they're saying, well, he would know. He's an expert. There are other archaeological experts who say actually it's not as straightforward as he's making it sound, and counter that with their own definitions. So here are my challenges with this. I'd have to take a deep breath every time, because his point is that African Americans, and he specifically points the finger and blames African Americans, and he says this is a fallacy that they have bought into because they are desperate to see Black Egypt. The problem with what he's saying, this is just a fundamental problem that I have with his comment, is where is Egypt again? What continent does it lie on? What are the population of the people? How are they perceived, looked upon outside? No matter how you want to claim being something else, when when the bullets come flying, they don't care that you are from Egypt and not from another part of Africa. You're all, in fact, the same. And so my fundamental problem with his and many of the comments that have been said is that there is this distance in yourself from a continent to which you belong, from a people to which you are party to. What are you talking about? And to say that there were as if there was nothing at all Black about Egypt whatsoever, they are clearly just Europeans on a different continent, is frightening, the anti-Black sentiment. And having followed a number of Egyptians who are educationalists, what they talk about in their own world and in their own words about the anti-Black sentiment that happens within Egyptian culture and Egyptian people, I was actually quite horrified and a little bit disgusted by, to be honest. And so this one left me feeling a little bit, I would say, unhappy. But that's probably putting it mildly. But I think you might have a few more articulate words to say, Mr. Storm.
I think as a nation, modern Egypt is living in a case of national cognitive dissonance. And I say this, I didn't spend long there. About 2 weeks I was in Egypt. And you travel around. And just lying in the undergrowth, you would see statues, massive statues. I mean, I'm 6'6". these things are bigger than me, right? And the features of them are clearly sub-Saharan African, right? And these things are common, just lying all about the place. When you look at the hieroglyphics, the ones that still have color, the Egyptians are depicted as dark, right? You go there. I was talking to this Egyptian guide that I hired to take us around for the time I was there. And he was adamant he wasn't black and Egyptians weren't black. Let me tell you something. This guy, yeah, he was pretty dark, right? And he's there telling me he's not black. Okay, son, I'll tell you what, you leave Egypt and then see what happens. But even within Egypt, they deal with colorism.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting
Really big problem.
right? What's really interesting is you come outside of Egypt, and the Egyptians I know, they tell me that they are African and they are black. Never mind, they got blonde hair and blue eyes. Right? Because they recognize that once they step out of Egypt, all that colorism nonsense that they're dealing with there goes out the window. Yeah. As soon as they say to someone, I'm Egyptian, outside of Egypt and in Europe, they get thrown into the categories of being African and black. And so although they're blonde and blue-eyed, they are staunchly adamant that they are African and they are black. Right?
Yeah.
And as I said, I think there's a massive case of national cognitive dissonance in Egypt, because you can't look at all these historical artifacts, be so proud of them, and then when the creators of these artifacts have depicted themselves within these artifacts, then try and distance yourself from it. And so there is a problem with anti-blackness within Egypt. And I think they need to recognize that what's being done is being done for a purpose. Right? Because once you discredit Egypt as being a country of which black people ruled over for centuries and made massive achievements and historical achievements, they're essentially doing their best to whitewash black achievement out of history and to claim it for Europeans and the influence of Europeans within that country. And that's far from the case. In fact, we can historically say it went the other way around. One of the prime examples of this is that it has been established the pyramids could not have been built without what we call today Pythagoras' theorem. The pyramids predate Pythagoras, but it is named after a Greek person. Make that make sense.
Well, you know, I'm going to just add a little can of worms to the whole thing because I think it's interesting. I think with the creation of whiteness and its ever expanding definition that's currently in process, what I find very interesting is that Greeks, Spanish, Portuguese, Italians, Cypriots, you know, that whole southern region has become white, because we know, living in Northern Europe, that that is not the case. We have friends who have been horrified when they've moved from those southern countries to Northern Europe and have been met with, but you're not white. And what actually happens when we create this ever-expanding definition of what white is, and it continues to kind of encompass other people because it's trying to survive. And so we can talk about the historical evidence towards how Irish people became white, how different Italian people in the United States became white. And there is historical moments in which you can see that overtaking, that it's ironic, it's ironic that his evidence is, well, she was part Greek, when actually Greek people wouldn't have been considered white as we define it today, because that definition got expanded to them so that you could claim Greek theories as white theories, when in fact you don't see Greek people in that way and you don't treat Greek people in that way. So rather interesting that you want to shift this ever-expanding definition of whiteness to these different countries and replace their culture, replace their identity with a sense of whiteness, which is again not really helpful. But what the Egyptians are doing are trying to include themselves in that wave so that they too can benefit from this creation. But in doing that, it's going to eradicate your history, your identity, and everything you have achieved up until now, and make it the product of a white system of oppression. I don't know that that's what you want to do. I'm just guessing that's probably not it. I'm just a guess. So that's just my little a can of worms in there, because I just think it's a bit of a joke, really. I think he's so upset about this, and so are many. And this has been, you know, the fact that it's taken up as much news stories, but we have things like the God of what was it, Gods of Egypt? Pure white people in it, not a single person, not even from Middle Eastern, you know, kind of background, if we want to call it that, which I think is a problematic term anyway. But, you know, like what are we saying right now? All of the films that have been made, I mean, but you want to spend pages because one queen has been made to look mixed at best. Come on now. And she actually looks more different than most people.
Simple question. Why have they not been up in arms over Liz Taylor's depiction of Cleopatra?
Because that would fit. This is this man is saying is that would fit a Greek model, but she don't look Greek. What are you talking about? She don't look Greek. Greek people are dark people. What's wrong with you? Like, what?
That's my point.
Like I said, the hypocrisy. No, but this is the kind of whitewashing that you're getting with this creative term, where it's beginning to encompass more and more people, you know. And we could talk about the one drop theory and how that had to be dropped from the KKK, because of course, as soon as they started doing DNA testing, they realized that they all had more than one drop, and so they had to change it to skin texture or color or hair color only, you know, whatever. Or as Daniel says facetiously, I guess, everyone knows that Liz Taylor was Egyptian. What are you saying? Anyway, on to another favourite subject of ours, before we get on to the final bits. And this is the actual prison and prison reform system. So there's two stories back to back that I want to just cover very quickly. One is that 8 EU nations are experiencing overcrowded prisons for the first time in a long time. The latest data shows that this is actually increasing and becoming more problematic. One would wonder what's happening within those 8 nations. One could argue that the cost of living crisis, where people are experiencing more poverty than ever, might be increasing your prison population because people are struggling more. There might be a link. That's my query. But this story I found to be much more disturbing in a way. So there's an article in The Guardian. It was done on the 13th of May, and it is by Tim Adams. And he says, Napoleon's words come back to haunt us as a prison barge for our time sails in. And so prison ships have forever been associated with the worst excesses of English injustice. On the eve of Waterloo, Napoleon stiffened the resolve of his troops by demanding, soldiers, let those among you who have been prisoners of the English describe to you the hulks and detail the most frightful miseries which you have endured. So if you actually go back through, you have a look at the fact that what was happening is that they were using these great big boats to imprison people, and British the English, I shouldn't even say the British, let me not take down the rest of the countries with that. The English are known for being particularly cruel within their prison systems. And this weekend, to the shame of the nation, is what he says, not my quote, but his words, the idea of a prison barge has sailed back in. And so the Bibby Stockholm, currently being refitted in Falmouth, is to moor at Portland near Weymouth to house 500 asylum seekers. And the question that he asks is, will future generations again be invited to look back on the images and imagine the lives of the desperate people incarcerated offshore and the wealthy democracy that put them there? And so here we have a massive problem that is how the UK are housing asylum seekers. Again, it's at the forefront of the news, and a lot of people have a very strong opinions in the UK about this. But prison barges are back. Prison populations are rising within Europe. There are some problems that are on the cusp of what we're doing. And I think that that's something that we could definitely continue to reckon with. Daniel said prison cruises. Oh, Lord.
Listen, coming from Bermuda, I have to say I know about soca cruises. I know about dancehall cruises. I know about booze cruises.
Mm-hmm.
Prison cruises was a new one for me from the UK. I gotta say, the UK taught me something new.
Well,
I don't think it'll catch on in Bermuda, but
no, I don't think the beautiful island will be incarcerating their people on a prison cruise anytime soon. But it is a question that we have to really, I think Western countries need to wrestle with. And England particularly, England have a particularly notorious history with crime and punishment. And of course, we know some of the excesses and evils that were done to their own prisoners and how they cope to this day with those who they see as dissenting forces, and also with asylum seekers. And we could talk about the coronation that happened over the weekend and the laws that were brought in to basically outlaw any kind of protest.
actually. But anyway, carry on.
Sorry, say that again.
I think we need to.
Well, you know, I think it was horrific we happened to be in the country at the time that this was going on, and to see this unfolding in real time and people's shock, horror, opinions, and not really understanding. It was one of these moments which seemed to, you know, austerity, cost of living crisis, recession, whatever you want to call the current climate of poverty that is waving through the UK, making it unsustainable, and seeing the way that people are suffering. But then to see the way that they're being placated with different holidays and events to try and, you know, make it look better. But in that, they have unrest. There is civil unrest, and English people are known for protesting. It's not something, you know, that you know, the protest is born. But to have those laws rushed in to action, and to have a police force, in their own words, say, we're not going to be taking any nonsense this time, so we're going to be clamping down. Well, what do you mean nonsense? What is nonsense? And before the whole procession had even started, I don't think it was even 8 o'clock in the morning, they had already arrested 65 people on anti-protest laws that had been rushed in, as I said, rushed in to block any protest. It was surreal, because as the news has been unfolding of, you know, the king being, you know, coronated and all of those things going on, to the backdrop of, you were seeing more and more news stories of arrest. And I can't remember the final numbers, Mr. Storm. Do you remember? It was something like 400 people that were arrested. It was a really high number of people that were arrested, and it got to the point where they had actually arrested workers for local councils who were doing good deeds to keep women safe. But because someone had printed a news story that would say that those methods were going to be dangerous to horses, they decided to arrest their co-workers, in essence. These are people that work at your council, and to this day they're not apologizing for their actions. I mean, it's
one of the key factors that you're missing in this is not just that they're working for the council, but they were working in partnership with the Metropolitan Police. So they were out there wearing high-vis vests with the Metropolitan Police logo on it, working on a project in partnership with the Metropolitan Police, and they still arrested them. I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
No. And people say, well, they were released without charge. But can you imagine the trauma of being arrested when you're at work by people that you're working with? I mean,
now this is actually why I want to talk about the bill, because what people are not understanding is they're actually living in a fascist state. I want to explain it to you how they're living in a fascist state. See, what this bill allows police to do is to essentially arrest people without cause, right? You can come up with the most flimsiest reasons and make it fit. Police officers themselves said, we don't know what's going on here. We're having to make it up as we go. Okay. Now, what this bill does, and this is in terms of outlawing protests, and why I say you're living in a fascist state, is because they're making people too scared to protest. Consider this, right? You are now a teacher and you get arrested. It doesn't matter that you're released without cause. The fact is that you have an arrest on your record. When you go to apply for a job, that arrest will show up. Not that you were released without charge, but that you were arrested. Okay? That means that future employment is put into jeopardy. And if you can't get employed, you can't afford to live. So they're making you too scared to go out and do that. If you belong to any other private institution and you get arrested, that private institution now has grounds to discipline you, which could include sacking you, because they can claim that you brought their company into disrepute. Right? So you have to understand what's actually taking place here with this public order bill. They are effectively trying to scare the populace into silence. And when you have this so-called living crisis, cost of living crisis, okay, people cannot afford to put their jobs in jeopardy. Right? So you, by outlawing the protest, they don't have to charge you with a crime to scare you from doing this. The other thing is that they are allowed to hold these people for hours and hours and hours without charge, despite there being clear evidence that there's no grounds to charge them on. And there's a hierarchy in place in which they use to level these powers at. Okay. Just Stop Oil protesters were the ones that they held the longest. And other protesters in there were saying, no, you could see that they were deliberately picking on Just Stop Oil protesters. And what they did was they held the protesters till after the 10 o'clock news cycle, so that they were able to put out whatever, the police were able to put out whatever disinformation they wanted to, right? And of course, by time any of the protesters got the right to redress that, it's the next day. But the other thing that they do is that they arrest you on spurious grounds. They seize your phone as evidence to investigate the crime. Okay. They then hold onto your phone, which means that when news agencies and outlets try to get in contact with you, for days and weeks after, they can't, because the police have your phone. But they are now able to investigate your phone, go through it, look for other contacts, other people that they might choose to investigate, and try and link with these. So what you have to understand is, people just look at this and say, oh, this is a public order bill. No, it's a public silencing bill. And you have to look at the mechanisms that are at play in its implementation to actually see what the true purpose of it is. And it's not by accident. This is by design, right? And you have the police and criminal Order Act that they brought in last year, I think it was, right? And they're just gradually ramping up police authority, police powers, and stripping civil liberties. And I think if people don't wake up and pay attention to what's happening, one day they're going to turn around and realize they'd probably be better off living in China.
Wow.
And I'm not saying that as hyperbole. I'm actually not saying that as hyperbole.
No. I think, as I said, with the backdrop to rising prison populations throughout Europe, full stop, with the backdrop to incarcerating or deporting asylum seekers to Rwanda or putting them on prison ships to live, with all of these things going on, and then you see that actually what they're next instituting is this kind of ban on protesting. Let's be honest, it's a ban. You can't say that any other way, unless the entire 65 million people turn out on the streets. You've effectively banned them from doing it, because you've built the case to really push people. You are seeing that what the West is doing is placating its people with, and I think you said this best, you're seeing the protection of sporting events at the cost of the people's freedom. And you very articulately likened it to going back to Roman times, when they would have the
just before the fall of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, just before the fall of the Roman Empire. And so I think we are seeing the outworking of a capitalist system that is failing. I think it's failing, and I think that it would behove all of us to really be mindful of what choices we're making, and who we're supporting, and how we're voting, and become more aware of what's going on around of us, instead of just throwing our hands up in despair, but really digging into our local communities and working out how can we be helpful, and what can we do to build systems of protection for one another, because the reality is the full out system is not doing its job.
And I think, to go back to the original story you opened with, which is education and critical thinking. One of the things that was outlawed was the ability of protesters to lock onto objects. The irony here, or the scary thing here, is people laud the suffragettes, but one of their most powerful tactics was locking onto objects. And you have ripped that power away from people that want to protest because they're scared of what the future holds, because of the pollution being done and damage done to the earth. You want to strip that ability away for change, for people that are saying, no, we protest against social injustice. We stand with refugees because what you're doing to them is wrong, right? For me, it's unfathomable that people would allow this method of protest to be taken away, because what they're not understanding is it's being taken away from them too. And so when this power was taken away, not to be funny, but women should have been in the streets protesting, because you know what this method of protest got you, and you know it can bring about change, but you were silent when it was taken away from others.
Well, I think many people don't, and I think this is one of the things that scares me the most. I think just a lot of people don't understand, and going back to the earlier story of education, I think a lot of people believe and are lulled into a sense that they are living a privileged life, that they have electricity and running water and a house over their head, and they can go to a food bank, and things aren't that bad, and they don't understand how the system connects and how things are actually working against them. And I think a lot of the times, I have to be honest, I think it is actually a lack of understanding. I think people really don't, this was some of the narrative that surprised me when you're talking to people about this in the UK and you're having one-on-one conversations, the amount of people that just la 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 la, don't understand it, feel overwhelmed by it, and this is how the processes get, this is how they're getting away with what they're doing. But there does come a tipping point, and I think that the reason for the laws coming in is because we're getting dangerously close to that tipping point where you've pushed the people too far, right? Poverty has become such a real systemic problem, you know, seeing in areas that would be so-called wealthy, or areas in which wealth dwells, seeing food banks in those areas for the first time, seeing stores that would be recognized as stores that would have poverty, would be associated with poverty in those areas, or being taken away from those areas in some cases, is something to watch happening in real time, and to see people's lives and stresses. But again, with the extension of these kinds of ridiculous working hours that people are doing, I can see and have empathy for how they've gotten into a situation where they don't know, and as much as I hear collectively we should all be protesting and we should all be out, I also understand that when you're working 12-hour days to make rent, to make food for kids, to do the things that you have to, the last thing on your mind is trying to figure out the political system. And every time you open a newspaper or you listen to the news, and this is why I have such anger towards some of our news channels particularly, you hear this very biased news reporting, very much demeaning people, very much in the process of just feeding the capitalistic system. You realize how poor we are for how poor we are, but how poor we are for the fact that we just don't have access and energy to actually deal with this. And not to forget that we are living in the backdrop of mental health crisis. There is not enough counselors, psychologists, etc. And people are, the suicide rates are increasing. These are all things that are contributing to an environment in which people don't have the time to know what's happening. And I think even with those laws, had we not be taking such a keen interest in global affairs, etc., would we have known about those laws as quickly? You probably would. But even for myself, you're so consumed with paying the bills, working life, getting the kids ready, there is so little time, or so you're told, that understanding political systems, etc., is really difficult. And the fact that a lot of those stories, particularly watching it unfold in real time, the 24-hour news coverage of how wonderful it was, and having all the pretty people out giving interviews and doing all of those things, but to the backdrop of your local news media outlets reporting the numbers of arrests in their area, and not putting together those two pictures at the same time to see exactly what was happening. And I think there was a meme that really covered it well for me, which is the one of the golden carriage crossing the London streets that have been filled with sand because the people are too poor to put, to fill the holes in the road. This is the kind of bravado, this is the kind of picture that we're putting on. We can't afford to deal with our crumbling nation, but there's a golden carriage going along that's going to make us all wave and cheer for a new king. And I think it's horrific to see that. But Daniel says it's failing us because it's supposed to. For those in power, it's working just as planned. Indeed, there is that problem. Do you have any other news stories? Have I covered them all for one day? Because I have one final one.
Listen, I'm just watching the time. We're good.
Okay, so there's one final story that I want to end on, because we're not only about the things of talk about anti-racism, etc., etc. We're also about action, and one of the things that we can have action for is that there is a cyclone, Mocha. It's a deadly cyclone that has hit Bangladesh and Myanmar. It has hit those two countries really hard, and the reason that I am covering this today is because I think it's an easy call to action for those of us who are able to. We know people from the Myanmar community who live and church with us, and how difficult their situation is there politically, and how frightening it is not to be able to contact your families, etc. So to have a cyclone hit is really you know, it's the last thing that these people need, on top of the statewide controls, the upheaval of their governmental system, the lockdowns on the internet, and all the other things that have been going on in this country through the coup, etc. To have a cyclone hit is just devastating. And I know that the people there will be desperate, but also there are people outside of their country who have family there who will be desperate as well. And so the call for action, as with all of these things, is if you know, if you can, if it's possible, not only to, of course, pray, but to actually act. Find a registered charity that you can work with that is of sound mind, and donate, because, of course, these are going to be long-term issues. Bangladesh, notoriously, it talks about the fact that they're still living. It was a Category 5 storm, and more than 1,300 bamboo shelters have been destroyed in the world's largest refugee camp. So on top of everything else, you're talking about people who are already refugees, who are now being put through hell because of the amount of destruction that this storm has wreaked. There are landslides, there are floods also hitting the areas there. It's just awful. This cyclone is doing awful. And so we can not only pray for those people, but if there is a call to action, if there is something that we can do, we can certainly do something for these people who need our help. And so, yeah, that is the story I'd like to end on. Mr. Storm?
Was there a question?
Do you have anything else to say?
Nope.
Well, I would like to say a massive thank you. You've been with us, viewers, Daniel particularly, for 3 years as we have been doing the dark side. We are ever so grateful. I am really, really touched by the amount of people that get in touch or meet us as we travel about and say how this has impacted them positively, to do research, to look into things, to actually go and vote, or to hold their political systems to account, and to make changes in their daily life. It really does encourage us to keep going and to keep talking, to discover new things, to direct and to educate. This is what we love to do, and I'm really grateful to have this platform and opportunity to do that. So thank you for being with us on the dark side. Season 5 will come to an end in July. And so we only have a few short weeks, believe it or not. June is on its way. So we only have about 6 to 8 weeks of programming. And so if there is a topic that you would like us to cover, if there is something that you have burning, that you have questions about, or you don't understand, please do feel free to send us the topic, and we will do our best to do some research on it and let you know. And by we, I mean him. He's the researcher, really, if I'm honest. I'm back to reading, but the researcher is still in the house. So thank you for your trust. Thank you for following along with us. Thank you for watching The Dark Side. Mr. Storm?
Yep, ditto.
Alrighty then. Well, we're going to sign off for today, wishing you all the best. Have a brilliant one, and we will see you next time on The Dark Side. Peace.